Hello everybody, welcome to the channel. In today's video, we're going to talk about one of these settings that's a little bit hidden away and is only available on PC. And I wanted to talk about it a little bit because I did have an FOV video where I was talking about the difference between console field of view, 100 FOV, and 120. Console is over at the lower end, over at 80, but in the game, it does allow you to put it down 60, but that's a whole nother story. What I did want to focus on was another setting in game that allows you to differentiate between your ADS FOV and leaving it on independent versus affected. I got a lot of questions about it, so I'm going to be breaking that down specifically and what it actually does in today's video. If you enjoyed the video or learned something new, please do me a favor hitting that like button. Goal on today's video is 4,000 likes, which you guys have been crushing, by the way. Definitely appreciate that. And if you're brand new looking to find your way back for more Call of Duty content, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on. Also, just a heads up, my Gfuel code is boosted all the way until the 7th of September, up to 30% off. So if you want to try a sampler and you're going to kind of get a mix of a bunch of different flavors, try them out and see if a tub is something you're interested in. Let's get into the breakdown. So the setting we're talking about is over here in the general setting on PC. So this is something if you're interested in maybe seeing if you want to switch over to PC, especially going into the next year, hopefully with the new consoles, we'll be able to get a little bit of FOV changer because this is currently only available on PC, which is kind of unfortunate, but at least you'll be able to see the advantages and disadvantages when people are making an argument that PC it's not a big difference. It's definitely a big difference, and we'll go ahead and kind of look at what this is doing here. Obviously, there's pros and cons to both of these options. There's independent as well as affected. So for ADS field of view, it says independent is aiming down sight, zooms the field of view to its usual value, and then affected does aiming down sight, zooms to a value closer to the field of view setting, only applies to low magnification levels of 3.25 or less, including iron sights. So this is going to include all your reflexes, holos, and your VLK, but once you go up in the higher optic sniper scopes and stuff like that, that's not going to work for it. So we're going to be able to see a side-by-side comparison. I already ran all the tests, got the screenshots, so you'll be able to see the actual difference. All right, so I made myself tiny for this one over on the top left. What I did is I took screenshots at different FOVs on both independent and affected. So that's what we're going to look through here. So how this is separated is this entire left column is 80 FOV, which is console FOV. And you'll see why console doesn't even have this setting for independent and affected real soon. And then right here is 100 FOV for independent and affected. And then we have 120, which is the max FOV or field of view on PC for independent and affected. We're going to see how this changes and progresses pretty easily on each of the different optics and the iron sights. So what we're looking at here is you can kind of see where this cuts off on the 80 FOV for console. If you're on PC at the exact same spot, looking at the exact same location, if you bump it up to 100 FOV, it kind of stretches it out and you get to see all the way to this second target on the right. And then we go all the way to 120 FOV, you get this left edge where there's a target on this side, and then all the way to the far right, you can see it goes way past this little board. So the advantage is huge as far as being able to see in your peripheral, fairly large. You're going to be able to see wall to wall pretty much everything. So when it's on independent, that means it's going to have a fixed aim down sight. So with different optics, there's a certain amount it zooms in or doesn't if it's less than that 3.25. What we can see right here is this is the standard FOV of 80 for console, and you can see that it cuts off right at this X. And again, this was done at the same FOV of 100, but on independent, you can see that they're lined up. So this ends up being the fixed ADS zoom when you're on independent. So you can see this one ended up doing the same on the right, even though we're at 120 FOV. So it actually goes from that zoomed out FOV to independent. It'll zoom all the way in to basically give you the ADS of what it looks like on console. And there's pros and cons to both of these, which I'm going to go ahead and talk about as well as we go through the various optics, but I'm going to go ahead and show you in game why this ends up being a benefit and a drawback as well. So now then when we put affected, that means now whatever your FOV is, it's going to be applied to your aim down sight. So it's going to change how much you're able to see. And what we can see is on the bottom left, pretty much ends up being the same. We didn't really see any difference between independent and affected because on console, you can't change that difference. But on PC, obviously once we go to 100, you can see that now the FOV, it is zoomed out just a little bit more. And you can see that you're kind of getting the FOV, the full FOV of what console gets. You can see kind of where this red is dripping off this wall. You can kind of see it lines up with the top left, which is 80 FOV. So basically when you're aiming down sight, it's going to be 80%. It's looking like of your FOV when you're at 100 FOV, if that makes sense. So now when we go to 120, we can see the same thing happening. It's going to scale it down to 100. If we're going to skip this one because it's pretty much the same. But what you can see here is when your ADS on this bottom right, it matches up with the field of view on the middle top, which is 100. So basically you're knocking down your FOV by 20 when you ADS. So that's kind of what transitioning here. So overall, when you aim down sight on console, you're dropping your field of view from 80 down to 60. So it drops it by 20. From 100, you're going to drop it by 20 down to 80. And from 120, you're going to drop it by 20 down over to 100. So that's pretty much what happens in those settings. Let's go ahead and look at what it looks like for the Holo, which has a different zoom setting, as well as the VLK. And obviously for these ones, we're going to zoom through a little quicker. I just want to make sure those were completely understood. As far as organization purposes, these are all in the same spots as the other ones. And pretty much this middle row is identical. We're getting that 60 FOV zoom, whatever that ends up being when we're zooming in here. You can see that we get the same thing regardless if it's affected or independent on 80 FOV, because that's kind of where the standard is set. And then what ends up happening here is we're getting a little bit of extra. It still has an optical zoom because normally the Holos have like a 1.5. So instead of giving us the 80 FOV that we get over here for this bottom one, it's zoomed in a little bit more. And it's actually zooming in much further. And we're going to see how that plays out once we go to the 120. We go to the 120, you can see that the FOV we're getting right here is 80 FOV that we're getting in our top left panel over here. So when we're looking at how that aligns, basically you're cutting off 40 right there. So it ends up being a pretty significant difference there. And this one ends up, like I said, zooming in even more than this, somewhere halfway between the 80 and the 60. So this one's probably like closer to 70 FOV from 100. And this one is closer to 80 FOV from 120. So those are the differences when you're getting those optical zooms. Now let's go ahead and check out the VLK. So the VLK, it's going to be a little bit more noticeable because the VLK is a 3x zoom. Again, all this ends up being pretty much the exact same on this left one at the 80 FOV. So console, that's why there's no difference. Again, when we look at it at 100 FOV, you can see that it goes to the edge of this blocks right here, and then it gets us all the way over here. So it's definitely zoomed in quite a bit. It's kind of hard to say exactly where it is because it's even more zoomed in than the 80 FOV. And this one, even on the bottom right, which is 120 FOV, when we're ADSing, it zooms in further than this one. So you can see it kind of lines up with where that box is, where the red X is on the bottom right, it lines up with our 80 FOV. So pretty much depending on what the optic is how much it's going to zoom, but you can see there is a considerable difference because if we're looking at this one all the right at the max FOV, if we just stick to independent, we're going to get the standard zoom, but when we do it this way, we're going to zoom in a lot, but not quite as much because this is normally where it cuts off. You're going to get this extra parts on the side that aren't visible with this middle one that's locked on independent. So now we're in a match. We're at 80 FOV, which is console FOV on independent. So we'll go ahead and check that out. Console FOV independent. So we're locked in there and it makes sense. And what I'm going to do is show you the pros and cons to having your FOV higher, as well as having it on independent or affected, because there are pros and cons. It's not universally better or universally worse. So what we're going to do is fire a little bit of shots here, get a recoil pattern. And what I'm going to do is aim down sight. And what I want you to do is look at how big that recoil pattern is. And when we increase the FOV, we're going to see how that changes. So we got that there. Let's go ahead and put this to the max FOV. So now you can see that I have the independent on. So right here, it ends up looking the same. When I aim down sight, this is the same as what we saw at ADS FOV. So if you want your recoil to look exactly the way it does on console when you aim down sight, this is what you're going to want to do, is leave it on independent. So obviously the upside with this is having the higher FOV. So if somebody happens to be on the side of the wall right there, you would have seen them, whereas on the ADS FOV you won't. So that's a pretty big difference when we're talking about comparison there. Now let's go ahead and talk about ADS when we switch it to affected. So now when I put it on affected, this is why a lot of times if you see content creator that plays on affected with the high FOV, looks like they don't have any recoil, because in reality, look at how much less recoil it looks like. Even though in reality it's the same amount of recoil, it's just, it's zoomed out, so obviously it's gonna look like less. And initially you're like, oh man, that's easy. That's a good thing, right? That's 100% easier to manage your recoil if I only got to aim straight. You just aim it and you just shoot towards the bottom, right? But it does come with the drawback, especially if you're not using a high zoom optic, which we saw with the VLK to give you a little bit more, not a high zoom, but with the VLK, a higher zoom optic, it's gonna make it harder to spot targets and actually track them once you've found them. So what'll happen is right here, if I put this options, if I put this on independent, look at how in focus that target gets, right? I could pretty much hit that dude pretty easy, right? This is this is console. Look at how much it zooms in when you ADS. You get a little bit of aim assist if you're on controller, but whatever, you get that, you could see the target. It's pretty visible. But when I switch to the affected, it's a much smaller target to hit, so it'll be a little bit harder to track, because obviously the scale, the same thing with stretch resolutions people are doing way back when to try and stretch out their target, you end up with a little bit different looking target. So this, in my opinion, is a little bit harder to hit unless you have a high zoom optic, or a higher zoom optic, not high zoom because it's not applied by it, but a 3x like we're seeing with the VLK, it's definitely going to make a difference when you're aiming down sight if you have it at affected or you have it at independent. So it really comes down to preference. Personally, I've been debating going back and forth. I haven't found one that I really like. I felt like if you want to use iron sights, 100%, but I'm not going to switch mid-game. But I like the M4 so much, so this is like, would be my preference. I can hit my shots here, pretty easy to hit, you're good to go. Versus with the other way, I mean, it's not as noticeable when you run a VLK, so it's really a matter of preference. So, two questions for you guys. One, did this help to clear up the difference between independent and affected? Hopefully it did. Let me know in the comments section. And do you think this is fair that PC players have this additional option in their game menus and console players don't? Obviously the option doesn't really matter unless you have more FOV, but in my opinion console players should have more FOV. So having more options is always better in my opinion. We'll see how that changes. If you did enjoy the video, let me know by hitting that like button. If you're brand new looking to find your way back for more Call of Duty content, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on. And again, my Gfuel code is discounted until September 7th, so make sure you go ahead and take advantage of it. Link in the description or code JGOD at checkout. Thank you for watching, and as always, have a great day.